Welcome to episode 75 of the Cashflow Connections podcast. The topic for today is, what does GDP tell us about the state of the economy? Today, we're going to take a deep dive into several of the data points that make up GDP and discuss what this data implies about our current economic outlook. If you keep up with any economic blogs or follow the market in general, you know that things are starting to shift for the first time in about 10 years. So today we're going to discuss what these shifts really look like, what they imply for the economy, and as well as what they imply for us as investors. Generally speaking, we're seeing GDP growth numbers coming down and down on a quarterly basis, and it's late in the cycle. So you better pay attention, you better know what's going on, and you better take a listen to this episode. First of all, we're going to talk about what GDP is comprised of and why it's a commonly used economic metric. We're going to discuss why it's mathematically impossible to keep driving down unemployment. This is something that we've been relying on for a long time. It's spurred a lot of economic growth, but there's a certain point where you truly run out of workers. So we're going to discuss that as well. We're going to talk about rising interest rates, what this really implies for economic growth, most notably as it relates to home construction, home sales, car sales, and things like that. And we're going to talk about what it means now that the tax cuts have been implemented and that we've seen that run up in the market as a result of those tax cuts. What takes place now? Because we've kind of habituated to those new tax cuts, and it's very unlikely to have a similar tax cut in a year or two. So a lot of really interesting topics, all of which have significant implications for us as investors. There's no surprise, we're starting to see some headwinds in the economy. So the question really becomes, how significant are these headwinds? How exposed are my investments? And what's the best way to navigate into the future? Of course, the timing of this conversation is pretty perfect because we're just entering a new year. So with that in mind, I wanted to wish you all a Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, Happy New Year. All the listeners, you know how much I appreciate you. I know I didn't mention that in the previous week, so I just wanted to mention it now. I know a lot of you are in the process of planning for the future, setting goals, creating a battle plan for 2019, and I'm extremely excited about the year. I'm going to be putting out an episode where I discuss some of the highlights of 2018, as well as go through kind of an outlook for 2019. But for now, just know that I'm extremely appreciative of your listenership. 2018 was truly a life-changing year for me. All listeners on the show are a driving part of that. So I really can't thank you enough. I am extremely lucky to be able to do something I truly love to do every day. All of you make that possible. So truly, thank you again very, very much. And like I said, we're going to be doing that 2018 review and 2019 outlook episode very soon. So keep that in mind. But for now, Happy New Year, and I hope you enjoy the episode. How's it going, everyone? Our guest for today is Elliot Eisenberg, who is an internationally acclaimed economist, a Ph.D., and a public speaker who specializes in making the minutia of economics fun, relevant, and educational. Elliot, I know we have a ton to talk about, so I want to jump right into it. How are you doing? Thanks again for coming on.
My pleasure, and I'm in a great mood, actually. I'm in Massachusetts. My girlfriend lives here, and marijuana sales became legal today. So how much better does it get, you know?
Perfect. You couldn't have timed your trip more appropriately. You know, I actually heard you through my attorney who saw you speak at an event, and I believe that it was a CPA event. And he said, look, you got to get this guy in your program. He really knows his stuff. And he didn't put everyone to sleep, which is very rare for some of the data that we're going to get into today. So I'm definitely looking forward to jumping into the details.
That's a sad indictment for other economists, but it's true. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, I want to talk about the economy today, obviously, and a lot of people are listening to this because they're really concerned about a lot of things in the economy. The most important thing that I hear cited over and over again is the length of the economic expansionary period. I know that this has been quite unique in terms of the length, in terms of the number of months that the economic expansion has taken place, but I wanted to get the opportunity to discuss why this may not paint the whole story and why people like yourself, that's not the main metric or one of the main metrics they actually look at when trying to predict, where we are in the cycle.
Right, absolutely. So the record duration was the decade of the 90s, exactly 10 years, 120 months. Right now, this recovery is about 112 or 114 months. Next July or June, it breaks the record for the longest ever. And it should. There's no reason why this shouldn't break the record and be at least 10 years long. But that's not what's relevant. What's relevant is how bad inflation is, how much input costs are, how fast the labor force is growing, how low unemployment rates are. Those are what really gives us some indication of how fast GDP growth can be and when we're going to run out of stuff and how close we get to a policy mistake. I think that's the best way to think about it. Recessions happen because something goes wrong. Recessions don't occur just because of old age, because of recovery lasting too long. That doesn't happen. You don't stop working because you've worked 10 or 15 years in a row. You still have bills to pay, a mortgage to pay, car payments, child support, alimony, a girlfriend, a mistress, a beach home, fill in the blank, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, go ahead.
So if you look at these facts, yourself, wow, our economy is going to stop. We're at 3% right now, Q4. We were growing at over 4% in Q2, then 3.5% in Q3, 3% now. And a year from now, we'll be at 2%. So at 2%, late in the cycle, with low unemployment, inflation rising, wage inflation going up, that's the recipe for something going wrong. Doesn't mean it will, may not, but it's certainly a higher chance of it. And that's why people like me start saying, 2020, a recession's entirely possible. Maybe not, but maybe.
Okay, and I want to jump into some of what you just went over, because that's obviously a body of a significant amount of data and work putting into analyzing that data. So from your perspective, what are some of those metrics that you just outlined in terms of where we currently stand and how strong or weak are we based on those metrics you just outlined?
So we're good right now. Our economy's strong right now. There's no question. We had Q2 GDP was 4.3. Q3, it just ended a month and a half ago, was 0.5. And Q4, which we're halfway through right now, is about 3. But you don't have to be a genius to see the declining rate, 4.3, 3.5, and now 3. That's substantially slower. And we'll keep slowing down. One of the reasons is we're running out of workers. Labor force growth by, people retiring vis-a-vis people entering the labor force, right? You have all these millennials coming in, but these boomers retiring. That's about 100,000 people a month, net job, new people. But we're getting about 200,000 jobs a month in job growth. And the only way we can do this is by driving the unemployment rate down. That's what we've done. We've been dropping it by 0.5 percentage point a year. So, it was 3.7 now. A year ago, it was 4.2. But we can't keep going much lower than this. It's one of the reasons we're going to slow down. The second reason is interest rates keep rising. That puts the kibosh on home construction, home sales, existing home sales, car sales, construction generally, right? And then the third thing is the fiscal stimulus goes away. The Congress passed a 2-year, $400 billion stimulus package. It ends in 2019. So that goes away. And the tax cut that occurred a year ago, almost to the day a year ago, we will have habituated to it. We're not going to keep getting more tax cuts, so our paychecks aren't going to keep going up. So the fiscal stim goes away, monetary stimulus goes away because rates are going up. We're running out of workers. The globe is slowing. Right? Global growth is slowing a little bit. The dollar is strengthening. There's some trade wars, which reduce GDP too. That's a lot of headwinds. So I can promise you GDP growth is going to slow way down. No one can tell you when the recession will come with any certainty, and I can't either. But I can certainly say, hey, you got a lot of headwinds here. If something else goes wrong, like the Fed raises too fast or oil prices spike on top of all this, that could tip us into recession.
Okay, that makes sense. And one of the metrics you mentioned there is GDP. I wanted to focus on that for a moment and give the listeners an understanding of why you like GDP as such a major factor. Obviously, it's a huge macro data point, but Can you break down GDP and give us an understanding as to why you focus on that?
Sure. So if you look at subsectors, GDP is composed of everything we make or produce. So it's all goods like cars and boats and stuff. And then all services like going to a restaurant or a baseball game or getting your shoes shined, your healthcare or education or everything is GDP. And it's composed of 4 parts: household consumption. So houses are buying stuff, goods and services, heating services, air conditioning services, lawn care services, schooling, jujitsu lessons. There's corporate investments in plant and equipment, building stuff, government spending on munitions, on defense, on Medicare, Medicaid and stuff, and then exports, net exports. How does that go? Now, when you look at all that together, it gives you a really good picture of the economy, because while some sectors may go up in any given quarter just because of good luck, or maybe goes down because of bad weather or some weird spike in something, if you look at the totality of the story, it vacillates much less. So you're trying to look at a variable that's relatively non-volatile. And the bigger the area you look at, the less generally volatile it is. So you might want to look at consumer spending. That's a good measure. It's the households and what they're spending. But let's suppose there's a tax cut that boosts consumer spending wildly, and it wrecks the data. But at the GDP level of everything, there's other things that cancel in the other direction. Not necessarily, but often. Nothing goes up. Not all sectors of everything go up at once. So you get a clearer picture. And this slowing of GDP is very obvious and very understandable and explainable. And that gives it a lot of meaning.
Okay, and when you're looking at that, are there any challenges with the GDP calculation for looking at the current state of the economy? Is there anything?
Sure.
Like
there's always problems.
Yeah.
There are always problems. I mean, government spending can go bonkers, right? Like this, a tax cut does all kinds of weird things to it. So now we know the tax cut was here and the spending increase is here. So even though we're looking at a $20 trillion economy, the data is still noisy, and you have to clean that. I mean, think about your own household. Let's say I look at your spending on apparel for 1 month, clothes, right? But maybe it's August and you just spent $2,000 buying 5 suits at a discount price, really great price, 5 suits for $2,000. And then you or your wife bought a dress, and you bought clothes for your kids. And that month you happen to spend $4,000 in apparel. You might say, oh my gosh, this is phenomenal. This is great for GDP. But at the same month, you didn't go on vacation. You didn't buy a new car. So you look at one thing, it gets kind of messy. Even if you look at the whole economy, it's messy, like all your spending, regardless of where you spend it, be it apparel or clothing or house or auto or vacation, it's still confusing. So there's some art and there's some science to this, both.
Okay, but I guess part of your argument is that because of how large the data set is, it starts to account for a little bit of those things. Because the sample size is so large, you get a much more clear understanding of that. And yes, there are challenges. You mentioned you're basically equating government spending to private sector spending, and that's not necessarily the case in terms of efficiency or output, but over all things being equal over a large enough sample set, you get a good metric, basically. So I'm sympathetic to that.
Right. Look at trends on a big thing, and that gives you some pretty good leverage on what's really going on. I mean, there are some other data points I look at that are really weird. I don't want to introduce confusion to your listeners, but there are ways to unpeel even some of the more volatile things within GDP to get to a smaller GDP, but still big, but less volatile. So you always want to get big and not very bouncy. If you can do that, then you're kind of golden.
One of those metrics is, or I believe, consumer sentiment. This is something that shifts and changes. And what are your thoughts on consumer sentiment? Where are we now, and what does this tell us about the current state of the economy?
Oh my God, consumers are happy out of their mind. They must all be at this pot shop near my house here where I am, and here in Northampton, Massachusetts. They've been lining up around the corner since midnight or something to be the first people in mass to buy pot. I mean, households are at decade highs in consumer sentiment, at least 20-year highs in consumer sentiment. A couple different measures you can look at. Bloomberg puts one out. University of Michigan puts one out. The Conference Board puts one out. They're all at or above 20-year highs. Consumers are thrilled. Unemployment 3.7%. I mean, how much better does it need to get? Anybody who wants a job gets a job. There's no reason not to work. And now the stock market's very turbulent right now. But most Americans don't care about the stock market. They don't own a lot of shares outside of a retirement. And many Americans don't own many shares or any shares in a retirement plan either. So it's the job market that really determines how happy we are, not the stock market.
Okay, and that's interesting because it's kind of a segue to the next question there, which is this metric can it be deceiving, or is it at least counter-cyclical in some regards? Like, you see the highest peaks of consumer sentiment right before the most significant pullbacks or crashes. Is that something that is historically the case, or is that just a matter of really the employment situation, which is what you're alluding to?
Right. Let's not confuse things. It's the unemployment rate that gets very low, making people very happy. And because the unemployment rate's low, wage inflation starts to pick up because employers are chasing workers. They're offering more money. Come to my company, I'll pay you $1 more an hour or something, or a $5,000 signing bonus. And therefore, workers leave. That pushes wage inflation up, which causes inflation to go up, right? Which causes the Fed to raise rates, and they raise rates too fast, generally, or too much, and they drive us into recession. So it's not the consumer sentiment that's the problem. It's the underlying unemployment rate and the inflation that results that causes the recession because the Fed raises rates too much.
Okay, and we have seen very low unemployment, especially over the last year or two, but we really haven't seen...
49-year low.
That certainly puts it in perspective. But at the same time, we haven't really seen that much wage growth. Is that something that you can speak to in terms of why have we seen what appears to be a rare situation where we have very, very low employment, but we've had for quite some time a very stagnant or non-existent wage growth?
Right, that's a prescient, great question, and it's one that's consuming labor economists quite a lot right now. They're really looking into research into why, and I'll give you 4 or 5 explanations. The first is just demographics. So you have the boomers that are retiring. And these boomers are, 65 years old. They're at the end of their careers. They're making relatively large amounts of money. So let's suppose they're making, $200,000. And they're replaced by a high school grad or a college graduate who's making, let's say, $40,000. Well, if you just subtract $200,000 from wages and put in someone making $40,000, take away 10,000 people a day making $200,000, and put in 13,000 people a day making $40,000, average wage growth declines. So this demographics alone is pulling down average wages. It doesn't mean wages aren't going up. It's just this aging of America is having a negative influence. That's one. The second one, worker productivity is terrible. I mean, it totally sucks. If you pay workers based on their output, per piece, you pay them piecemeal, right? Per pizza made or per hoodie sewed, or you get the per contract executed, or you get the idea. The productivity of the workers from year to year isn't going up much. Why? That's a whole separate question. Let's not go there right now. But you won't pay them more because of that. So that's a problem. The third one is there are very few unions. We can argue if that's good or bad, a separate question. But because unions aren't pervasive, cost of living increases aren't automatically put into labor contracts. There's the Uber effect. Things are cheaper. You want a cab. Cabs are expensive. Uber's cheap. You want to buy something in a store, it costs money, a lot of money. You buy it at Amazon, it's delivered to your house free, and it's cheaper than in the store. So that's driving down inflation, which also drives down wages too, because wages and inflation there's some correlation there, right? Last but not least, there are also fewer new firms out there. So employees have fewer places to look for a job. You have big corporations, GM and GE and Google and Microsoft, but there aren't as many new small firms cropping up. A lot fewer, many fewer. So these firms that are looking for workers don't have as much competition. And on top of that, in many states, workers sign non-compete clauses. So if you get fired from your job, you can't even get another job in your field for a year. So that means you're not going to quit, so they can give you a lower wage. So there's a whole bunch of factors, demographic factors, legal factors, productivity factors that are conspiring to keep wage pressures much lower than they've been in prior situations like this, late in a cycle. Back in 2000, 99, 2000, 2007 or so, both late cycle times, wage growth was better than it is now. Right you are.
Okay, that's pretty fascinating. You definitely jumped into a bunch of different details there, and I want to get into especially one of them. One of them is that, yes, it is true that we haven't seen a lot of wage growth. Like, I have seen many data points that suggest that we really haven't seen wage growth when it adjusted for inflation in decades. And but
we
what
could
you're
argue
saying,
on that one, but your point
okay,
is generally low wage growth. Let's say low wage growth.
very
Not
low,
none, but low, real wage growth.
fair enough. I guess the interesting thing in what you're kind of touching on, though, is that we've gotten a lot of things for cheaper. And so you may not really need increasing wages to have what most people associate with better wages. Like your lifestyle becomes significantly better if you don't have to pay a $10 for a cab ride and you can pay $3 for an Uber ride, or if you can get your stuff delivered to you. Is that kind of align with what you're outlining there?
Right. That's some of what's going on, right? Real inflation is much lower than it's been too. Productivity is lower on one hand, but inflation really is low. Inflation is barely 2% right now. If you compare it to 10 years ago or 20 years ago, inflation pressures were greater. So let's say you want to show a 1% real wage increase. Now 3% wage increase minus 2% inflation gets you 1% wage growth. Whereas 20 years ago, you might have needed 5% wage growth to cover 4% inflation. You still had 1% wage growth. So this reduction in overall inflation enables wage growth to be at least as good at a lower level, at a lower rate, 3% versus 5%, because there's so much inflation out there. And why that's occurring is partly, we discussed it, but there's other factors going on too.
Okay, and I guess this is interesting. Historically, it's relevant, but is it noteworthy to you then, the lack of wage growth, in the sense of, is this something that, other than the fact that it's historically significant, is this telling in some way other than, it hasn't happened in a long time?
Oh, it's very telling. It's important because it's weak. Inflationary pressures are weak. And because inflationary pressures are weak, because don't forget, wages are 60% of total corporate bills. Corporations spend 60% of all their money on salaries. So if salaries aren't going up much, there's less inflationary pressures. And that gives the Fed an easier time in raising rates. They can do it more slowly. They can take their time. They can be relaxed. They can be much more deliberative. If you think back to the last time we were late in the cycle back in 06, 07, the Fed was raising rates twice as fast as it is now. And eventually they got it wrong and drove us into recession. Partly their fault, partly not. Now they're raising rates once every 3 months, not once every 6 weeks, and maybe they'll even slow it down. They're afforded this luxury because inflation and therefore wage inflation is very meager. And therefore they can recorrect a little better, and the chance of going into recession because of a monetary policy mistake, raising rates too fast, is less. No, that's a good thing.
Yeah, certainly. I'm really glad that I asked that question, because that is a really important data point that I hadn't really considered, but especially when it ties into the Fed, I think that's very, very important to consider.
Yeah.
So I got a question about kind of tracking jobs related to the income growth or lack thereof, tracking jobs on an income basis. So for example, David Stockman, who talks about, quote, breadwinner jobs, talks about jobs in goods production, white collar professions, business management, transportation, distribution, et cetera, finance, insurance, those types of jobs. Right. Let's just say, for sake of example, $50,000 a year or more. What are you seeing in terms of those numbers? Do you track those numbers? Is that relevant? And what are you seeing in terms of that?
Well, all job growth is relevant. All types of job growth are relevant. And what we've seen is that in this cycle is different job sectors, or not job pay sectors, if you will, high pay, middle pay, low pay, having leadership roles. So early in the recovery, and for a long time in the recovery, it was the upper classes and the upper middle classes that did really well. Now, oddly enough, for the last year or so, year and a half maybe, it's been the lowest classes that are finally getting the benefit of the improved labor market. And that's not altogether unusual. It's often the case that the lower classes benefit the most at the end of the cycle, right, but they benefited very little to date up until this year, a year and a half ago. That was the problem. So the Fed's now saying, let's not kill the party here. We don't want to raise rates too much, because the lower classes, they've essentially been screwed, if you will, pardon the language, by the economy and tax policy and global supply chains and so on. And they haven't benefited. Their incomes haven't caught up to where they were 10 years ago. And it's only late in the cycle that they're really benefiting. So let's hope that they get some more pay raises and they at least catch up to where they were 10 years ago. And part of the reason their wages are going up for these very poorly educated people, this is high school grads and even less than high school grads, folks with less than a high school diploma. In part is because everybody else has been hired, one. And two, there aren't that many of those people anymore because more and more folks go to college. So you're actually running out of people with just a high school diploma or less than a high school diploma. And you've hired everybody else because you're desperate for workers. So now you're taking the lowest class of workers available, and that depresses labor productivity growth because they have no skills, and that reduces wage growth too.
Interesting. And I think that there's a lot of data regarding a significant amount of the jobs that were, quote, created after the Great Recession were in those low-income jobs. So not those, quote, breadwinner jobs. So you're seeing a lot of competition in those areas, and therefore the wages in those areas are increasing. Is that aligned with what you're saying as well?
They're finally going up, right? I mean, if you think back 8 years ago, back in 2010, 11, 12, unemployment was, 9, 10%. So, employers had it over employees at that point. The employees were desperate for a job. So if an employer said, I want someone with an MBA and a Ph.D., who's a doctor, by the way, in vascular surgery, and I'll pay $12 an hour, 20 people showed up for the job. And that depressed wages too. But now it's turned around. Now there's no one to hire. They're hiring, people fresh out of prison, which is great. It's never been a better time to look for a job. Let's get these people who haven't been in the labor force. Let's get them in now. It's critical to get these people into the labor force attached to working. They enjoy getting a paycheck. They'll stick around and work.
Fair enough. All right. I want to switch the conversation over to talking about something that comes up in a lot of these conversations, but it's still challenging even for me to really wrap my head around the implications of it. And that's the $20 trillion question. How does the U.S. debt, not the consumer debt, but the government debt, play a role in most consumers' lives? Like, how should most consumers or even real estate investors be thinking about numbers like the debt to GDP ratio? And what does this mean to the average person in the United States?
It's a great question. And it's so vast, it's hard to understand, but you are framing it and thinking about it appropriately. Don't think of the $20 trillion or whatever the number is. It's important to think of it as a fraction divided by GDP, because GDP is the ability to repay the debt, if you will. It's debt to income ratio, or in this case, debt to GDP ratio for a country. And most people don't think about this at all. They think about their take-home pay. They think about their pay compared to last year, or their pay compared to their neighbor, or something like that, some comparative pay, right? No one sits around and thinks, oh my God, the debt's really big. It's a real problem. Only bored people like me and you do that because we have nothing else to do with our time. But the data is very clear on this. The higher the ratio of debt to GDP, which is now total debt is 20 trillion and GDP is 20 trillion. So it's 1. The ratio is 1. And public debt, the debt that we actually pay interest on, for which there are bonds outstanding, is about 76% of GDP. The difference being money the government owes us in terms of Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security payments, and so on like that. Promises down the road. As that ratio goes up, GDP growth slows down. So we're hurting our children and our grandchildren because we're going to have more taxes to pay the interest on this debt, which I'll get into in a second, and that slows growth. Right now, total debt payments, the total amount of interest payments on our debt are about $400 billion. Not all that much. But every time interest rates go up by 1 percentage point, that total amount of debt service goes up by $200 billion. That's a lot of money. That's 1% of GDP, close to 3 to 3.5% or 4% of all government spending. 4% of government spending. That's a huge amount of money. In not too distant future, higher rates and increasing deficits every year of $1 trillion, you add the deficits on top of the debt, on top of the higher interest rates. In 7 or 8 years, debt service, so interest on the debt, will exceed what we spend on defense, which is $650 billion. So this becomes a inordinately large percentage of government spending, and it crowds out everything else. I mean, you can't spend it on Medicare, Medicaid, you can't spend it on education, you can't spend it on defense. This slows down growth, and you have to have higher taxes to raise the revenue to pay the bondholders. Okay, the bondholders are mostly domestic. 60% of our debt's held by Americans, not foreigners, but foreigners hold a bunch. And you got to pay the bill, and that's what causes problems. Higher taxation reduces GDP growth too.
Yeah.
So it's a slow, think of it as slow growing cancer. It's not a car accident. It's just a slow illness that gets worse over time.
Yeah, I think that metaphor is very valid. But I mean, I guess
and it feels
the real
good
question,
while you're doing it. It's like smoking cigarettes. It's awesome. Nicotine's wonderful for you. You feel great. You're energized. You're more alert. You're ready. But just down the road, it kills you a little bit earlier.
when you see the global macroeconomic picture and you see that there are many countries out there that have significantly worse debt to GDP ratios and also don't have the dollar reserve, as the currency of their particular currency. What are your thoughts on that and how it ties into this conversation about the metaphor regarding cancer? Because I think that's a fair metaphor.
It is and it isn't. I mean, the U.S. is the world's biggest economy. The currency, as you mentioned, is the world's currency. So we can do a lot more stupid things than other countries can. If you look at a country like Turkey or Argentina or South Africa, or Brazil, or let's say Uzbekistan or something, they have much less leeway. They make some policy mistakes. They can really go down the tubes in a hurry. And they have. You've seen their currency situation really collapse in very short order. In a few months, they go from good to bad, or in a year from bad to terrible. We have a lot more time on our side. We're better educated. Our labor productivity is high. We have decent amounts of wealth. People want to move here in droves. So we can withstand more trauma, and hopefully Congress will get it right. But don't compare us to these Greece, for example, or Lisbon, Portugal, because their fiscal situations are much more tenuous than ours are. But it's certainly an object lesson. If we're not careful, in the very long run, we can become really troubled too. But don't forget, Europe will probably be troubled at that point as well, along with Japan. We're not going to probably be isolated, but it's a concern. You can see you can hear it in my voice. I am concerned. Our fiscal situation is not good, and it's getting worse.
Well, I think one of the ways to demonstrate that is looking at the deficits, and the current situation is pretty significant. Walk us through, why these deficits and the fact that we're running these particular deficits, especially at the end of a business cycle, which is basically comparable to, some previous recessions. Just give us an understanding of that and what the implications of that are.
All right. So if we think right now, unemployment's 3.7%, right? That's spectacularly low. The last time we had unemployment rates this low was in 1969, and we ran a budget surplus. And late in Clinton's term, so 1969 we ran a surplus, early in Nixon's term. Then we ran a surplus late in Clinton's term. Unemployment was also very, very low. It was also under 4%, not as low as today, but also under 4%. So the last two times we had unemployment under 4%, we ran budget surpluses. They're the only times we've ran a budget surplus in the last 50 or 60 years. Now unemployment is also under 4%. So you would say, we should be running a budget surplus. And I would say, yes, you should be, but we're not. Instead, we're running $1 trillion deficit, which is about 5%, 1.1 trillion, about 5% of GDP. The biggest deficit we've ever run as a percent of GDP outside of a recession or a war. And everything is good now. Tax revenue should be skyrocketing. Income taxes should be high. Social payments should be low. Unemployment insurance, welfare payments, right? They should be low because everyone's working. So here we are in a golden period. Everybody who wants a job can get a job, yet we're running massively large deficits. This is adding to our debt, which we just talked about, lowering GDP growth, and making it more difficult for us to deal with the next recession when it comes, because it'll be hard for us to open the financial spigot and offer tax cuts and fiscal stimulus because we'll already be running these huge deficits before the recession comes. So these tax cuts and spending increases that Congress passed, Republicans did in December of last year, a year ago, and then Democrats and Republicans did together in January or February, are ridiculously ill-advised. They stimulated an already strong economy and increased our deficit for no good reason, essentially.
Yeah, that is pretty telling. I mean, if you go back and look at the deficits on a proportional basis, you'll actually see they're comparable to the 82, 83 recessions. And interest rates were at 16 and 17%. So the idea is, what will the Fed do if you do start to see things turn around, given the fact that you can't really push the needle much further, you can't have employment growth at this stage of the cycle. So it's just pretty fascinating given the historical perspective.
You bring up an issue of, can the Fed really raise rates a lot? Because if they raise rates too much, the interest costs become punitive, and will that have this terribly adverse impact? But if they don't, inflation will show up, and that will be very destructive too. So the Fed's got a hard road. The only saving grace here is that interest rates can't go very high because our economy can't grow very fast. This 4%, 4.2 that we experienced in Q2 and 3.5 that we experienced last quarter, these are aberrant growth rates, only the result that are the result of these ill-timed fiscal policy decisions of tax cuts and spending increases. Absent those government policies, those fiscally stimulative policies, we wouldn't have growth going so fast. It's a temporary boost, lovely though it is, but it's temporary. So low growth, low GDP growth leads to low interest rates. So even if rates go up, they don't go up a lot. So we can get ourselves under control if we can reduce our get our deficits down. Not even that much. To bring it down to 500 billion would be fine. That's all we have to do. Cut it down from $1 trillion to 500, 600 billion. We'll be okay. Really. That would give us a lot of time to solve our problem.
Interesting. I could dive into that for another hour and a half, but I'll spare the listeners that. But that's an interesting.
Next conversation.
Yeah, exactly. So I want to give you an opportunity to discuss the real estate market. Obviously, a lot of listeners are paying attention to this with the intention of, letting this data guide them in their decisions to a certain extent.
Sure.
And I wanted to hear your perspective on the current state of the housing market. Obviously, that's a broad question.
Yep.
Real estate's very localized, but from your perspective, what are some of the things you're seeing as to where we are and what metrics are you using to come to that conclusion?
Right. Look, the key thing that's going on right now, the overarching thing right now is rising rates. And rising rates are starting to really bite. And you see the housing market, if it's not turning over, it's certainly plateaued, right? You see existing sales, pending sales are going down year over year. Existing sales are flat to declining. New home starts came out saying permits, and they're essentially flat. And this is what happens late in the cycle when the Fed starts to raise rates. Because what's the most interest-sensitive sector of the economy? It's three different things. It's automobile sales, they're flat. Housing starts, they're flat. And total construction activity. This is commercial industrial stuff. Hotels, office space, warehouses, and so on. And that's flat too. And that's what happens when rates go up. If you add to this the shortage of housing, house prices rising ahead of incomes not rising all that much, you have a huge number of problems in the housing market. And it's starting to really affect sales, inventories going up, starts are flat to declining. It's not a happy time. So if you're looking to buy real estate today and flip it tomorrow, I'd be a little nervous. But if you're looking to buy a home to live in it for 20 years, I'd say, do what you want to do and don't worry about it. If it's a nice house, you can afford it. Rates are still very low. I'd buy it. And I wouldn't worry much about the capital gain. It might go upside down for a couple of years. It will come back.
Interesting. It's very much aligned with the data that I'm seeing regarding, existing home sales, for example, housing starts, et cetera, and interest rates rising. Do you pay attention to the commercial sector of real estate at all in terms of like multifamily or any of those asset classes, self-storage, et cetera?
Yeah, multifam actually has done pretty well for itself. And multifam right now is in a bit of a soft patch. There's a tremendous amount of multifam coming on market because of permits that were pulled, 2 years ago, 3 years ago. Lots of permits were pulled. And often these projects don't start right away. It takes them a while to get started. And now lots are coming on the market. So we're oversaturated now with supply of new multifam structures. So rental increases are going up much more slowly than the past. But we're not building enough single fam, and there's tons of job growth. These people and these households have to live somewhere. So I think multifam comes back with a vengeance in a year or two when this supply growth slows down and returns to more normal numbers. So I'm pretty bullish on multifam. Elsewhere, overall, it's hard to be wildly enthusiastic with higher interest rates and slower growth coming. Corporate profits are going to come down from the spectacular growth they've experienced to much more mundane levels. It's hard to see a massive boom in corporate investment in plant and equipment here. So
I'm neutral at best on general commercial construction, with multifam being I think the general exception, being pretty bullish on that one.
One of the things we were talking about earlier was the national debt. Of course, the consumer debt has changed significantly over the last decade or so. There's been a massive shift away from mortgage debt because less people are buying houses and into student loan debt, which we've seen absolutely skyrocket over the last 20 years. What are your thoughts, given the implications of what it means to own a house and have a mortgage as opposed to what it means to be in pursuit or have a massive student loan and, in pursuit of getting a diploma?
Right. So let's go back and look at total household debt. Total household debt's come down substantially from where it was. It's come down by 20 percentage points of debt. Debt to GDP ratio, household debt, is really in good shape. So households as a whole, their total debt today is only 5 or 6% higher today than it was 10 years ago at the peak of household debt, at the peak of the housing boom, when we were buying homes for nobody, right? So in the grand scheme, things are good. But as you clearly point out, student loans are a real problem. And they're manifesting itself in these poor youngsters, these millennials who are, 24, 25, 30, the ones above 30, because millennials are, say, 21, 22 to 38 or so. That's the age group. The older ones are buying houses. They've gotten out from under their student debt. The student debt problem wasn't as bad 15 years ago as it is today, and so on. But it's certainly delaying these kids from getting married, buying a house, having a baby, and of course, the all-important having a visible tattoo. You have to have a visible tattoo to show that you've succeeded if you're under 25, right?
Right.
Maybe on your neck or your ears or ear gauges. I'm not criticizing here. I make just jokes. But it's certainly delayed. And if you add to that student loan payment of, say, $300 a month or $400 a month, a car payment of $300 or $400 a month, that's a lot of money if you're 22 or 23 and your first job out of college. It means you can't save, you can't start putting away towards buying a house in 6 or 7 years when you hit 30, 31, 32. So it's delaying everything. Delaying population growth isn't so much. Marriage rates are lower. Number of kids are lower, partly because of the student debt. That said, the student debt problem is not big enough to drive us into recession all by itself. The students will default on it slowly, and over time it will get socialized. Congress will end up paying all the student loan bills.
Man,
because these millennials will go to Congress and say, hey, pay it off for us, dude. Otherwise, we won't vote for you. And they will. And that'll solve the problem for them.
Yeah. And then it'll be all of our problems, just like every time that is the case. All right. So you mentioned interest rates being, it sounds like one of your most important indicators in terms of something that could go wrong, a black swan event.
Yep.
Other than interest rates, is there anything else that you're looking at as a potential recession predictor or causer?
Yeah, let's think of causers. Let's not think of predictors. There are lots of things that are predictors, like there's tons of them, predictors. But the ones that really concern me now are certainly interest rate hikes that are too fast, that drive us into recession all by themselves. And that happens a lot. The next thing is something with China could badly go wrong. They could start to slow down dramatically because they're running out of fiscal stimulative maneuvering room. They massively fiscally stimulated their economy back in 2009, 10 in the depths of the recession, but it caused their debt to GDP ratios to skyrocket, and they're going to try and do it again. I'm very nervous. Countries with this much debt on their books tend to have very bad outcomes. So I'm worried about China. I'm also worried about Europe. They're taking a big beating. Italy's causing a real crisis in the euro. Brexit's, Britain leaving the Eurozone is a real problem. It'll hurt European GDP. It'll hurt British GDP. That's a lot of global GDP. The Eurozone's roughly as big as we are. That's a big problem. And trade is a huge issue. And the longer this trade dispute goes on, the harder it is to resolve. And on Jan 1, Trump's going to boost the tariffs on imports from China more, and China will retaliate in some way, equally, roughly. And this is going to slow down global export growth and slow down GDP growth. So you've got, fiscal policy that may go badly. You have China that may go bad. You have Europe that may go bad. You have trade that's a problem. And you have emerging markets. If Turkey, and Argentina and Brazil and Mexico and on India and whatever all go down the tubes together, that could conceivably draw us into a big mess. It's less likely, but hey, that keeps me up at night. So don't do it. Don't. You sleep well, I'll worry for us. That's the promise I make.
Okay, so You have mentioned rates again as being one of the main things that you're looking at. It's obviously, historically speaking, that's been unquestionably the cause, or the pin that pulled out the weight that then fell on everyone. Basically, is the way that
think of
Feds
it as
raised
straw meet camel's back.
Yeah, exactly. So do you see, and obviously this is a crystal ball type of question, but do you see in the next 12 months, what are you anticipating the Fed actions will do? I mean, are you in line with them raising rates, 3 more times in 2019, 4 more times in 2019, or what do you think?
4 is a bit of a stretch. There are people who are optimistic enough to think they're going to raise rates 4 times in next year. They'll raise rates next month. That's, I think, a foregone conclusion. I think they might not have done it, but Trump beating up on the Fed, I think, is going to force their hand largely. Next year, they'll raise rates anywhere between 2 and 4 times. It's impossible to say more than that. It's just, I can't predict what will go wrong. Maybe nothing goes wrong. Maybe GDP is better than I think. Inflation's less bad than I think. More people come into the labor force. Unemployment falls less than I think. They raise 4 times. But if unemployment falls to 3.2 pretty quickly, if inflationary pressures take the CPI, inflation rate well above 2 pretty quickly, they're going to slam the brakes on pretty hard. So it's data dependent. It's completely what they see. They'll respond to what they see. And so far, they've made good choices, but the choices so far have been easier. Now it gets hard because the consequences of making a mistake now are much higher than they were last year.
Interesting.
Because, and you get towards the peak of the interest rate rising cycle, an extra, 2 or 3 rate increases of a quarter point could make the difference between a recovery that continues and a recession that starts. When you go from 1% to 2%, who cares? But when you go now from 2.25% to 3.25%, that might be enough to tip us over the edge. So each rate increase now is fraught with more risk.
Yeah.
One more thing
Go ahead.
that I want to mention about potential recession problems is corporate debt. Household debt's in great shape, as we mentioned earlier. But corporate debt's getting pretty crappy too. And if earnings don't keep up, or if interest rates go up on variable debt that corporations have, of which they have a lot, this could start, so wages go up on one hand, so they got to pay more money to wages and pay more money to bondholders on variable debt. This could start to hurt corporate earnings. The companies could start defaulting on their debt, and this could end up being not too pretty. So it's another lower level concern, but a concern.
Interesting. Well, again, Elliot, I really appreciate that perspective. And I know that debt obviously is a driving factor of the economy at a certain extent because it's the majority of purchases, there's majority of purchases in real estate. Yep. And so interest rates are kind of the number one factor that everyone's keeping their eye on. I think that's a great time to wrap up, but I do want to give you the opportunity to let the listeners know how they can learn more about your stuff and find about the website you have, for example.
Oh, thanks so much, Hunter. So I put out every day 70 words on economics. No graphs, no ads, no charts, no links, and no photos. If you want to sign up, all you've got to do is go to econ70.com. So it's ECON, the number 7 and the number 0.com. And there you can sign up for my blog. Or just text the word bowtie. One word, no hyphen, no space. So it's BOWTIE. That's the body of the message. And it's a 5-digit number, 22828. And then it'll respond with, give me your email address. You will sign up via text for a nightly email on the economy and what's going on that's interesting that day in the economy. People seem to enjoy it.
See, it is easy as that, and we'll have that in the show notes page as well.
Super.
And, I can tell you, Elliot, I have watched several of your videos, and they're all extremely entertaining, but also extremely dense. So we'll also link to some of those because we covered just a little bit of this stuff on this conversation. So again, Elliot, really an honor to have you on. Let's have you on again in a couple of months if anything changes, especially regarding interest rates.
Sounds great. I'm happy. Sign me up. Be delighted to do it.
All right, listeners, thanks for checking out the episode. As always, the contact information for our guest will be available in the show notes page, which is hosted on SoundCloud, iTunes, and Stitcher. Don't forget, if you want access to some of the free goodies that I'm talking about at the beginning of these episodes, like free ebooks, weekly investor emails, and articles about some of the most important investment-related topics, make sure that you have created an account with CFC because this stuff is automatically available. You can do this by going to cashflowconnections.com and signing up as an accredited investor. Of course, if you have any questions, feel free to email me at hunterthompson@cashflowconnections.com. Thanks again.